Young schoolteacher took in a bride. Until she learned the groom was still alive, she opened her door to a bride in blood-stained lace, holding a telegram that would destroy everything she thought she knew about mercy. Sarah Whitmore believed she was saving a widow's life, but some rescues come with a price that can kill you. The wind that October evening carried more than dust through Cedar Hollow. It carried secrets, thick as prairie smoke, settling into the corners of every honest soul's conscience. Sarah Whitmore felt it first as a chill against her neck while she graded arithmetic papers by lamplight, the scratching of her pen the only sound in the small schoolhouse that doubled as her home. When the knocking came, 3 soft raps, hesitant as a child's confession, Sarah set down her pen and smoothed her brown wool skirt. 24 years of living had taught her that visitors after dark brought either death or trouble, and sometimes both wore the same face. She opened the door to find a ghost. The woman on her threshold swayed like wheat in a dying wind, her wedding dress torn at the hem and stained with what looked like rust or blood. Auburn hair fell in tangles around a face so pale it seemed carved from winter moonlight. In her trembling hands, she clutched a telegram, its edges soft from repeated folding. "Ma'am," the woman whispered, her voice barely more substantial than breath. I heard you take in boarders sometimes. I can pay." Sarah's eyes moved from the stranger's hollow cheeks to the yellow telegram, then back to eyes that held the particular emptiness that comes after the world ends. She had worn that same emptiness herself 3 winters past, when the fever took her parents and left her alone with nothing but a teaching certificate and a one-room school. "Come in from the cold," Sarah said, stepping back. The words came easier than breathing. The woman hesitated at the threshold, as if crossing might damn them both. "My name is Margaret Hayes. I am." The words caught in her throat like thorns. "You're tired," Sarah said gently. "Names can wait for morning." Margaret stepped inside, and Sarah closed the door against the October wind. The small room, with its neat row of student desks and Sarah's modest bed in the corner, felt suddenly cramped. The stranger's presence filled the space like smoke from a dying fire, visible but impossible to hold. "Sit," Sarah said, guiding Margaret to the chair beside her desk. The woman moved carefully, as if her bones might shatter. Sarah noticed how she kept the telegram pressed against her chest, the way a drowning person might clutch driftwood. Sarah busied herself making coffee on the small stove, stealing glances at her unexpected guest. The wedding dress had been fine once, silken Brussels lace, the kind that cost more than Sarah earned in 6 months. But now it hung on Margaret's frame like mourning clothes, beautiful and terrible at once. "My husband," Margaret began, then stopped. She unfolded the telegram with reverent care, as if it contained scripture. The mind collapsed. "Cave in," they said. They said he was buried too deep to dig out. The words fell into the quiet room, like stones into still water. Sarah poured coffee into 2 chipped cups, noting how Margaret's hand shook when she accepted hers. The telegram lay open now on the desk between them, its message stark in the lamplight. "Mining accident, stop Thomas Hayes confirmed, dead stop, deepest regrets stop." 3 days, Margaret whispered. "We were married 3 days." Sarah had heard such stories before. The frontier was littered with brief marriages and sudden widows, dreams buried as quickly as bodies. But something in Margaret's voice caught at her. Not just grief, but something else. Relief, maybe, or shame. "You came a long way," Sarah observed. "Colorado territory. I sold everything I could carry, took the stage to Denver, then the train." Margaret's fingers traced the telegram's edges. "I didn't know where else to go. My father's dead. No brothers. No sisters." Thomas had mentioned Cedar Hollow once, said it was the kind of place where decent people minded their own business. The coffee grew cold between them. Outside, the wind rattled the schoolhouse windows, carrying the scent of early frost and dying leaves. Sarah watched Margaret's profile in the lamplight, the sharp line of her jaw, the way her eyelashes cast shadows on her cheeks. Beautiful despite everything, beautiful and broken. "You can stay," Sarah said quietly, "as long as you need." Margaret looked up then, her green eyes wide with something that might have been hope or fear. "I don't want charity. It's not charity. I could use help with the children. Some of them are behind in their letters. And winter's coming. This place gets lonely." It was a lie, but a kind one. Sarah had grown comfortable with solitude, found peace in her simple routines. But looking at Margaret Hayes, with her haunted eyes and blood-stained lace, Sarah felt something stir in her chest. The same impulse that made her feed stray cats and tend wounded birds. Margaret nodded slowly, as if accepting a sacred covenant. "I'm grateful." They prepared for sleep in careful silence, Sarah offering her guest a clean nightgown and the comfort of shared space. As they settled into their respective beds, Sarah on her narrow cot, Margaret on a pallet of quilts near the stove, the October wind continued its restless song outside. In the darkness, Sarah listened to Margaret's breathing, noting how it caught sometimes, as if she were crying without sound. Tomorrow would bring questions from the townspeople, arrangements to be made, a new rhythm to be learned. But tonight, in the lamplit sanctuary of the schoolhouse, two women who had known loss held their griefs close and found comfort in not being alone. The telegram lay forgotten on Sarah's desk, its message clear in the moonlight streaming through the window. But secrets, like dust, have a way of settling into places you can't see, waiting for the right wind to stir them up again. Some acts of mercy plant seeds in salted earth, and Sarah Whitmore was about to learn what grows from such unlikely soil. For 3 weeks, Sarah thought she knew Margaret Hayes, widow, refugee, friend. But when a stranger rode into Cedar Hollow asking questions about a missing wife, Sarah discovered that some women don't flee death. They flee the living. November settled over Cedar Hollow like a familiar quilt, bringing shorter days and the kind of cold that crept through wooden walls and settled in your bones. In the 3 weeks since Margaret's arrival, a rhythm had emerged between the two women, quiet, careful, built on the understanding that some stories were better left untold. Each morning, Sarah woke to the smell of bread rising. Margaret had gentle hands with dough, kneading it with the kind of patience that spoke of long practice. She would work in silence while Sarah prepared lessons, their movements around the small space choreographed by unspoken courtesy. The bread always came out perfect, golden and warm, tasting of home and safety. "My mother taught me," Margaret had said once, when Sarah complimented her baking. Said a woman who could make good bread would never starve. Her smile had been sad then, distant, as if she were looking through years instead of across the room. The children took to Margaret immediately. She had a way with the younger ones, patient with their stumbling letters and encouraging with their arithmetic. Little Emma Caldwell, barely 6 and shy as a field mouse, bloomed under Margaret's gentle attention. Samuel Porter, whose father drank too much and whose anger often spilled over into the schoolroom, grew calm when Margaret helped him with his sums. "She's got the gift," Mrs. Henley from the general store had told Sarah one afternoon. "Some folks are just born to teach." Sarah had nodded and smiled, but something cold had touched her heart. Margaret never spoke of her past beyond those first few broken sentences about Thomas and the mine. When the subject came up, carefully, kindly, Margaret would grow still, her hands pausing in whatever task they held, her eyes taking on that distant quality that Sarah recognized as the look of someone learning to lie. The first real crack in their peaceful facade came on a Tuesday, gray and bitter with the promise of snow. Sarah was teaching the older children about the westward expansion when she noticed Margaret stiffen at her seat by the window. Following her gaze, Sarah saw a man on horseback stopped in front of the mercantile, his hat pulled low, asking questions of anyone who would listen. "Mrs. Hayes," little Emma tugged at Margaret's skirt. "You look scared." Margaret's smile came too quickly, too bright. "Just wool gathering, sweetheart." Sometimes grown-ups forget to pay attention too. But Sarah saw how Margaret avoided the windows for the rest of the day, how she jumped at every sound from outside. That evening, as they prepared supper together, Sarah finally asked, "Margaret, is there something you need to tell me?" Margaret's hands stilled on the potatoes she was peeling. For a moment, Sarah thought she might speak. might finally crack open the careful shell she'd built around her past. Instead, Margaret set down her knife and walked to the window, peering through the curtains at the empty street beyond. "Sometimes I dream he's not dead," she said quietly. "Thomas. Sometimes I wake up, and for just a moment I think I'm still there, still married, still trapped." Her voice broke on the last word. "Is that wicked of me, to dream of my husband's death?" Sarah moved to stand beside her, close enough to feel the tremor in Margaret's frame. Grief does strange things to the mind. There's no shame in it. But even as she spoke the comforting words, Sarah felt doubt creep into her chest like winter cold. Something in Margaret's tone, in the careful way she'd phrased her confession, felt rehearsed. Not false exactly, but incomplete, like a half-truth dressed up to look whole. The next morning brought frost thick as morning veils on the windows and news that chilled Sarah deeper than the November air. Mrs. Peterson, the banker's wife and Cedar Hollow's most reliable source of gossip, swept into the schoolhouse before the first bell, her cheeks flushed with excitement and cold. "Sarah, dear, you'll never guess. That man who was asking questions yesterday, he was looking for a missing woman, a young wife who ran off from her husband back in Colorado. Can you imagine? Abandoning her sacred vows like that." Sarah felt Margaret go rigid beside her. Did he find what he was looking for?" Margaret asked, her voice carefully neutral. "Oh no. Poor man. Said his wife's name was Margaret something or other. Pretty thing," he said, with auburn hair and green eyes. "Tragic, really. He seemed so desperate to find her." Mrs. Peterson shook her head in theatrical sympathy. "He's staying at the hotel, poor soul. Plans to search the surrounding towns." When Mrs. Peterson finally left, trailing gossip and good intentions, Margaret sank into the chair by Sarah's desk as if her legs could no longer hold her. Her face had gone white as winter sky, and her hands shook as she pressed them to her mouth. "Margaret." Sarah knelt beside the chair, her voice gentle but firm. "Tell me the truth." The words hung between them like smoke from a dying fire. Outside, the first snow of the season began to fall, soft flakes that would cover the world in deceptive purity. Margaret looked at Sarah with eyes full of tears and terror, and something that might have been relief. "His name is Thomas Hayes," she whispered, "and he's very much alive." The confession fell between them like a stone into still water, sending ripples through everything Sarah thought she knew. Margaret wasn't a widow. She was a runaway wife, and somewhere in Cedar Hollow, her husband was looking for her, driven by law and custom and the terrible certainty that she belonged to him. Sarah reached for Margaret's trembling hands, holding them steady in her own. "Tell me everything," she said quietly. "All of it. The truth this time." Margaret's tears came then, silent and devastating, falling onto their joined hands like rain on dusty earth. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering Cedar Hollow in white lies and cold truth. In the warm sanctuary of the schoolhouse, two women faced the moment when mercy and justice would have to choose sides. The bread Margaret had made that morning sat cooling on the windowsill, golden and perfect, and somehow terribly fragile in the gathering storm. The careful peace they'd built was crumbling like autumn leaves, and Sarah was about to learn that some truths cut deeper than any winter wind. Thomas Hayes kicked down the schoolhouse door like a man hunting prey, his eyes burning with righteous fury. But when Sarah saw the fear in Margaret's eyes, the way she shrank like a beaten animal, she knew this wasn't about love. This was about ownership. He came with the dawn, when the world was still gray and uncertain, like a storm that had been building on the horizon for days. Sarah heard the heavy boots on the schoolhouse steps before she saw him. Deliberate, angry, the sound of a man who believed the world owed him something. Thomas Hayes didn't knock. The door slammed open hard enough to rattle the windows, and there he stood, filling the frame like judgment itself. Tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair and darker eyes, he might have been handsome once. But whatever beauty he possessed had been eaten away by something ugly that lived behind his smile. Margaret went still as death beside the stove where she'd been preparing breakfast. The coffee pot slipped from her fingers and shattered on the floor, dark liquid spreading across the wooden boards like spilled blood. "Hello, wife," Thomas said, his voice soft as silk and twice as dangerous. Sarah stepped between them without thinking, her body moving on instinct older than thought. "Sir, you're in a schoolhouse. Children will be arriving soon. I'll ask you to. You'll ask me nothing." Thomas's gaze never left Margaret's face. "You're the schoolteacher. Sarah Whitmore. I've heard about you. Heard how you take in strays." His smile was sharp enough to cut. "How Christian of you." Margaret found her voice thin and brittle as winter ice. "Thomas, they said, the telegram said you were dead." "Did they?" He stepped into the room, closing the door behind him with deliberate care. "Funny thing about mine accidents, Maggie. Sometimes men get buried. Sometimes they dig themselves out. And sometimes," his eyes glittered with something cold and satisfied, "sometimes they come looking for what belongs to them." The way he said belongs made Sarah's skin crawl. She'd heard men talk about horses that way, about land and cattle and tools. Not about wives. "The mine collapse," Margaret whispered. "The telegram, oh, that was real enough. Cave-in killed 6 good men. I was lucky. Got thrown clear when the supports gave way." Thomas moved closer, and Margaret shrank back against the wall. "Spent 2 weeks in the company hospital. Unconscious most of it. By the time I could think straight, my loving wife had cleaned out our savings and disappeared into the night." Sarah watched Margaret's face crumble, watched the careful composure she'd built over 3 weeks dissolve like sugar in rain. But underneath the fear, Sarah caught a glimpse of something else. A flicker of the woman Margaret might have been before Thomas Hayes got his hands on her. "I had to," Margaret said, her voice barely audible. "Thomas, you know I had to." "Had to what?" His voice dropped to a whisper that somehow felt more dangerous than shouting. "Had to steal from your husband? Had to break your sacred vows? Had to make me look like a fool in front of the whole territory?" "Had to survive," Margaret said, and for the first time since he'd walked through that door, she looked him straight in the eye. The silence that followed was sharp enough to draw blood. Sarah felt it pressing against her chest, heavy with years of unspoken violence. She looked at Thomas Hayes, really looked, and saw the truth written in the set of his jaw, the way his hands curled into fists, the particular stillness that came before the storm broke. "Mr. Hayes," Sarah said carefully, her teacher's voice steady despite the fear clawing at her throat. "Perhaps we should discuss this privately." Away from what? Thomas's laugh was harsh as winter wind. "Away from the woman who's been harboring my runaway wife? Away from a place where Maggie's been playing house while I've been turning the territory upside down, looking for her." He turned his attention back to Margaret, and Sarah saw her friend, because that's what Margaret had become. Whatever lies lay between them, shrink further into herself. "Do you have any idea what you've put me through? The humiliation? Men laughing behind my back, talking about how Thomas Hayes can't even keep his wife in line." "I never meant," Margaret began. "You never meant." Thomas took another step closer, and Margaret pressed herself against the wall as if she could disappear into the wood itself. "You never meant to make me a laughingstock. You never meant to steal money that wasn't yours. You never meant to break every promise you made before God and witnesses." His voice rose with each word. "What did you mean, Maggie? What was going through that empty head of yours when you decided to destroy everything?" Sarah had heard enough. She moved to stand directly between Thomas and Margaret, her small frame hardly a barrier, but solid with determination. "Mr. Hayes, I think you should leave." Thomas looked at her as if seeing her for the first time, really seeing her. His eyes narrowed, taking in her plain dress, her severe hair, the way she held herself like someone accustomed to facing down unruly children. "Should I?" He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "See, Miss Whitmore, I think you're confused about the situation here. That woman behind you is my wife, legally, lawfully wed. What happens between a man and his wife is none of your concern. What happens in my schoolhouse is very much my concern." "Your schoolhouse?" Thomas looked around the small room with theatrical interest. "Paid for by the good people of Cedar Hollow, I'd imagine." People who believe in the sanctity of marriage, in honoring your commitments. Wonder what they'd think if they knew their schoolteacher was keeping another man's wife from her rightful place. The threat hung in the air like smoke. Sarah felt the weight of it. Her job, her home, her entire life balanced on the edge of a knife. Thomas Hayes knew exactly what he was doing. He'd played this game before. Behind her, Margaret made a sound like a wounded animal. Sarah, don't. Please. He's right. I'm his wife. I should go. No. The word came out harder than Sarah intended, surprising them all. She turned to face Margaret, taking in her pale face, her shaking hands, the way she held herself like someone expecting a blow. You don't have to go anywhere you don't want to go. Thomas's laugh was sharp as breaking glass. Listen to her, Maggie. Your Savior thinks she can rewrite the law of God and man with good intentions. He leaned closer to Sarah, close enough that she could smell tobacco and something sour on his breath. But here's the thing, schoolteacher. Marriage isn't a suggestion. It's a contract, and I've come to collect what's mine. The morning light streaming through the windows caught the bruises on Margaret's throat, old ones, faded yellow and green, that Sarah had never noticed before. Suddenly, everything made sense. Margaret's careful movements, her startled reactions to unexpected sounds, the way she flinched from raised voices. Thomas Hayes wasn't here for love. He was here for possession. And Sarah Whitmore, who had spent her entire life following rules and honoring authority, found herself face to face with a question that would define the rest of her days. When the law protects monsters, what does mercy demand? Outside, the first children's voices could be heard approaching the schoolhouse, bright and innocent as morning bird song. The moment of choice was coming like winter thunder, and Sarah knew that whatever she decided next would echo through both their lives forever. Sarah Whitmore faced down Thomas Hayes with nothing but words and fierce love. But sometimes revolution begins not with guns blazing, but with one woman refusing to let another be dragged back into hell. What happened next changed Cedar Hollow forever. The children's laughter outside the schoolhouse sounded like music from another world, bright and innocent, untouched by the darkness that had settled over the three adults inside. Sarah heard little Emma Caldwell's voice calling to her friends, Samuel Porter's boots scraping on the steps, the ordinary sounds of a day beginning. But nothing about this day would be ordinary. Time's up, schoolteacher, Thomas said, his hand moving to Margaret's arm. School's starting, and my wife and I have traveling to do. Margaret flinched at his touch, but didn't pull away. Sarah watched the life drain from her friend's eyes, watched her fold inward like a flower, closing against winter. 3 weeks of healing, of laughter with children, of quiet conversations over cooling bread, all of it crumbling at the touch of one man's hand. Wait! Sarah's voice cut through the morning air like a blade. The children need to be dismissed properly, given their assignments for home study. She looked directly at Thomas, her teacher's authority steady as stone. Unless you want to explain to their parents why school ended early. Thomas's eyes narrowed, but he recognized the trap. Cedar Hollow was a small town where every irregularity became gossip, every gossip became judgment. He needed Margaret gone, but quietly, without questions. 5 minutes, he said. Sarah nodded and walked to the door, opening it to the crisp November air. Children, she called, her voice carrying the calm authority that had commanded respect for 3 years. I'm afraid school is canceled today. Please return home and tell your parents there's been a family emergency. Emma Caldwell, barely 6, and always the first to worry, stepped forward. Miss Whitmore is Mrs. Margaret's sick. Sarah looked down at the little girl's upturned face, at the genuine concern in her wide eyes. Behind her, she could feel Thomas's impatience radiating like heat from a stove. Margaret stood frozen by the wall, a ghost of the woman who had patiently helped Emma with her letters just yesterday. Mrs. Margaret needs to take care of some important business, Sarah said gently. Now run along home, all of you. Mind a frost on the boardwalks. As the children scattered with the resilience of youth, their chatter already turning to the unexpected holiday, Sarah closed the door and turned back to face Thomas Hayes. But she wasn't the same woman who had opened it 10 minutes earlier. Something had crystallized in those moments, hard as winter ice, clear as mountain water. "Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice carrying a new weight. "Before you leave Cedar Hollow with your wife, perhaps we should visit Reverend Morrison. I'm sure he'd be interested in hearing about your marriage." Thomas's smile faltered. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means," Sarah said, walking to her desk with deliberate calm, "that Reverend Morrison takes a particular interest in the welfare of wives in his congregation. He's quite progressive in his thinking about domestic harmony." It was a calculated risk. Sarah knew the Reverend well enough to know he valued compassion over strict doctrine, but she also knew that men like Thomas Hayes counted on silence, on shame, on the conspiracy of looking the other way. "You think a preacher's going to side with a runaway wife?" Thomas laughed, but there was uncertainty in it now. "A woman who broke her sacred vows?" "I think," Sarah said, opening her desk drawer and removing a piece of paper, "that he might be interested in seeing this." The paper was blank, a lesson plan from the previous week, but Thomas couldn't see that from where he stood. Sarah held it like evidence, like proof of crimes unspoken. "See what?" But his voice had lost some of its certainty. "The medical notes I've been keeping. About Margaret's condition when she arrived. Her injuries. The way she startles at loud sounds. How she sometimes cries in her sleep." Sarah's voice remained steady, clinical. "I've been documenting everything, Mr. Hayes. Just in case." Margaret looked up sharply, hope flickering in her eyes like candle flame. Thomas's face darkened, but Sarah saw something else there now, fear. The fear of a man who ruled through secrecy being dragged into the light. "Those are lies," he said, but the words came too quickly. "Are they?" Sarah moved closer, the paper still in her hand. "Should we ask Dr. Henley to examine her? He's quite thorough in his records. Or perhaps Sheriff Morrison, the Reverend's brother, would like to hear about the bruises." The way she flinches when men raise their voices. The silence that followed was different from before, charged with possibility instead of dread. Thomas looked between Sarah and Margaret, calculating odds, measuring risks. In a territory where reputation meant everything and gossip traveled faster than horses, even legal husbands had to tread carefully. "You don't know what you're doing," Thomas said finally, his voice lower now, more dangerous. "You think you can protect her?" "I am her husband. The law is on my side." "The law," Sarah agreed, "but not the community, not the church, not the women who will hear Margaret's story and recognize their own." She stepped closer, close enough to see the uncertainty in his eyes. "How many wives in Cedar Hollow do you think have their own stories about controlling husbands, Mr. Hayes? How many would stand with her if they knew the truth?" Thomas's hand tightened on Margaret's arm, and she winced. It was a small movement, barely visible, but Sarah caught it. More importantly, so did Thomas, the involuntary betrayal of his own nature. "Margaret," Sarah said quietly, never taking her eyes off Thomas, "tell him what you told me. About the mine accident. About why you really left." Margaret's voice came as a whisper, but it carried the weight of years. "He would have killed me. If I'd stayed, he would have killed me." The words hung in the air like morning frost, crystalline and undeniable. Thomas's face went white, then red, then something between the two. "That's not. You can't." He looked around the schoolhouse as if seeking escape, but found only the steady gaze of a woman who had made her choice. "She's lying. She's hysterical. Women get ideas. Women get bruises," Sarah said simply. "Women get broken ribs and black eyes and explanations about falling downstairs." She looked directly at Margaret. "But sometimes women get choices. Sometimes they get chances to start over." Margaret pulled her arm free from Thomas's grip, gently but firmly. It was the first time she'd moved away from him without flinching, and they all felt the power of it. Thomas stared at his empty hand as if he couldn't understand how it had happened. "You can't do this. She's my wife. She's a human being," Sarah said. "And in this schoolhouse on this day, that matters more than any piece of paper." For a moment, Thomas looked like he might argue further, might try to drag Margaret away by force. But the sound of voices outside, townspeople beginning their daily routines, potential witnesses, made him reconsider. In a place like Cedar Hollow, violence against women happened behind closed doors in private shame. Dragging a screaming wife through the town square was another matter entirely. "This isn't over," he said finally, backing toward the door. "I know where you are now, Maggie. I know where you're hiding. This isn't over." But even as he spoke the threats, Sarah could see they carried less weight than before. Margaret stood straighter, her hand finding Sarah's. Together, they watched Thomas Hayes walk out of the schoolhouse and into the cold November morning. Through the window, they saw him mount his horse and ride toward the hotel, his back rigid with frustrated anger. But he was leaving. Whatever power he'd held over Margaret, legal, social, or emotional, had been broken by the simple act of one woman refusing to look away. As the sound of hoofbeats faded, Margaret turned to Sarah with tears streaming down her face. "What happens now?" Sarah looked at her friend, no longer the broken woman who'd appeared on her doorstep, but not yet fully healed either. Something in between, something becoming. "Now we make breakfast," Sarah said practically, "and then we figure out how to build a life from whatever pieces we have left." Margaret smiled then, the first real smile Sarah had seen from her. Outside, the November sun broke through the morning clouds, casting long golden rectangles across the schoolhouse floor. Somewhere in town, Thomas Hayes was probably planning his next move, consulting lawyers or writing letters to authorities. But here, in this moment, two women who had chosen each other over the easier path of silence began the quiet work of revolution. They cleaned up the spilled coffee together, their hands moving in the familiar rhythm they'd developed over 3 weeks of share mornings. And in that simple act, in the careful tending of daily things, they planted seeds that would grow into something the law books had no name for, but the heart recognized as freedom. In Cedar Hollow, they would remember this as the day the schoolteacher chose love over law, and love, as it turned out, was the stronger force.